down this end and work this way. But Steve, so what we heard was terrible, and we unfortunately have heard that story across the country in a number of ways. Election officials, I don't want to say you were anonymous, but you were somewhat anonymous in an earlier era, and maybe in a good way, and you've become sometimes well-known and targets of people's ire. What do we do about it? Both what do we do, and I know there are people involved in various efforts here, legally and institutionally or attitudinally. What is to be done about the great rise in personal threats to people who are running our elections across the country?
I think there has to be a narrative shift that the country has to embrace. I think I think of it as when U.S. soldiers during the Vietnam War and how they were treated, and regardless of, but we've moved to a culture in which you might not agree with the military action, but you support ultimately the men and women in the armed forces. And so I think that there has to be sort of this culture where you don't disrespect, you don't target the people who are working the actual election machinery, and you think of them as sort of public servants. You might not agree with every law, and as Neil said, that's certainly open for discussion and is something that we should continue to contest and to improve. But you don't go and target them as they come back from Vietnam, I guess. So a cultural change.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Stephen's saying. I would also add that, when you look at data currently, election officials, there's some good data out there that 3 and 5 are more afraid today than they were in 2020. And 4 and 5 are concerned about running their elections. In other words, getting the people to work them, poll workers, to actually come and work the elections. And to Stephen's point earlier about, I don't think this is going to go away, I definitely agree with that. So we need to look at ways to reduce the risk of these threats. And I'm working with a group called the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections. It's a 32-member nonpartisan body that is focused on working collaboratively together with law enforcement election officials to help reduce the risk. And how do you do that? You raise awareness, you work on plans with law enforcement to be able to respond if there are threats more quickly than perhaps in the past. I will say that we are seeing, there are election deniers in the law enforcement community, and that can create certainly problems around the country and something that we need to continue to work on.
Yes, I can tell you how it took law enforcement 45 minutes to get to my house, even though they knew an hour before the now infamous protest outside my house was going to begin, that it was happening. So yes, on all those things, I'll add 2 pieces. One, the law. So we in Michigan, the first thing we did in January with a cooperative legislature at the state level has been to introduce a package of laws to protect those who protect democracy, making it a felony to threaten election officials, stiffening the penalties as well, and the sentencing penalties. We're also pursuing a law to ban the intentional dissemination of deceptive practices in elections. So if you intentionally repeat or disseminate information or allow for the dissemination of information that you know is false about election procedures and the like, there should be penalties and consequences for that. Because we know that the root of these threats are this misinformation that then generates people to, with vitriol, try to attack those who are at the forefront of democracy. So strengthening our laws at the state level, I know Nevada, I know a number of states are doing that as well. It would be great to see the federal government make a stand on this and both support through financial investment our election officials and our elections, and also further protections. I know Senator Ossoff and others have proposed legislation on that front. But in the face of that inaction at the federal level, we're working at the state level to implement those changes and those additional protections. I think what Georgia's done to have a text system, so if a poll worker is threatened on election day, there's a place they can text that will connect to law enforcement clerks and others so we could rapidly respond, is important. So we're also adding additional administrative protections for election day as well. But the thing I really want to land with and sort of really emphasize here is what got us through 2020 is sort of like spiritually, emotionally, all that, was the fact that the truth is on our side. Like, democracy is on our side. The law is on our side. History is on our side. The Constitution is on our side. And the vast majority of the American people are on the side of wanting to preserve democracy and knowing that these threats are wrong. We find a lot of strength in those truths in Michigan and elsewhere. And through that, it enables us to sort of absorb that and come back stronger, to the point where, I've tried to kind of emulate that leadership in Michigan. I know others have as well, to really just show strength in the face of these threats, because that's how we get through it. But what I saw on Election Day in 2020 was extraordinary. First of all, we recruited 30,000 new election workers in Michigan in 2020 and another 11,000 in Michigan in 2022. Those folks are coming to our defense. They are coming to defense of democracy. And I visit polling places in every election, state, local, federal, throughout our state. What I saw in November 2022 was extraordinary, because usually when I show up at a polling place, people are just doing their jobs. When I showed up to the polling place, one of that I vote in, and there's a number of precincts in Detroit on Election Day in 2022, I was met with almost like this overwhelming force of energy coming from the election officials who showed up that day to work. Instead of being tired or sort of ho-hum or seeing the procedural, sort of doing their job, there was a pride there. There was a energy there that I have never seen before. And that was extraordinary to me. And I then saw that all around the state. The people who run our elections in many ways, when they come to it with that strength and emboldened by these threats, they stand up stronger and they do their work with more pride and determination to ensure these threats will not succeed at interfering with our process of election administration. So that's like real experience, and gives me a lot of hope that with leadership and with that strength and that knowledge of who we are, and that we're on the right side of history here, we can harness all that to actually create more energy around protecting our election officials, at the very least in the administration space. And that's what we've worked to do in Michigan. Obviously, it's not universal, but that's, in my view, the path out of this moment.
Okay, so my first question is, we often hear statistics about large percentages of Republican Party voters believing Donald Trump's false claims that the 2020 election was stolen. Is this a real belief, or is this more of a way of showing loyalty to Trump, a kind of performative aspect? What are the beliefs that Republican voters, rank and file voters, hold about the election system in 2020 and more generally?
Yeah, so you see these sort of big numbers, right? Like 70% of the Republican Party believes that the election was stolen. But not all of the people in those, you sort of have to bucket people out, because they while that big number is true, there are different ways that people think about the election. So there is a group of people for whom Dominion changed votes. They believe sort of the deep conspiracy side of this. And let's say these are kind of deep in the OANN, Steve Bannon media ecosystem and universe. And they are people who today still very much hold firm to the idea. A lot of them are still very much Donald Trump supporters. In fact, in the focus groups, one of the biggest indicators that I find of somebody who still very much wants Trump to be the nominee in 2024 is that they absolutely believe that the election was stolen in 2020. And it's not like a lightly held or a tribal pose. It's no. We have a corrupt election system. They were going to do anything they can to get rid of Donald Trump. The Dominion machines were corrupt. And that's one bucket. There's another bucket that is much more of a tribal pose, where they say, Democrats cheat. I don't like Democrats, and they cheat. And something was fishy. Something was off about the election. These people are great in focus groups, because they say things like, when I went to bed election night, Donald Trump was winning. And when I woke up, Joe Biden was winning. And how do you explain that? And you say, well, they counted more votes overnight and Joe Biden pulled ahead. And that is definitely an insufficient answer. But they don't have this concrete idea or some grand conspiracy. They just sort of think something was off. And this is where the media ecosystem on the right is really important, because you did have a lot of people, both in the media and also elected officials, who were sort of treading a line that was like, well, there's always some fraud, and, that we need to do more about election integrity and security. And so that's a different bucket. And a lot of the people in this bucket they say, right now, these are people who are interested in moving on to Ron DeSantis. They are not sort of the always Trumpers. And one of the reasons that they want to move on to Ron DeSantis, I always find this interesting, is because they think he is more electable. Donald Trump has been losing elections. And implicit in that rationale is the idea that the 2020 election was not, in fact, stolen, that Donald Trump is losing elections, that he is alienating too many people. And that's something that's pretty clearly articulated. There's also like a third group that I would just throw out there that's a much more, it's the Molly Hemingway rigged argument, which I don't know if people are familiar with this, but this is the idea, not that there were Dominion machines, not that there was ballot dumping, but that because of the pandemic, Democrats passed laws, made rules, that sort of changed the game. And this is sort of a more Wall Street Journal friendly argument, that it was about the rules changes that were unfair because of the pandemic, that sort of put the thumb on the scale for Democrats. And so that big number contains sort of a range. And I would say that you're seeing that number come down somewhat because that sort of middle group after the midterms were one of these things where a bunch of people had to say, you know what, we're losing, and so that, I think, it started to eat away at sort of that middle bucket that I was talking about.
I think one of the main things to study, really, in terms of election administration that so many really excellent scholars led by Charles Stewart are doing is to recognize that what the political parties are doing in terms of the way they do turnout is the epitome of why we are so polarized. That, unfortunately, fraud and suppression has seeped into the turnout models of both political parties and many nonprofit groups, and those messages sort of contribute to the real hate by one side for the other. So if I were going to look at some academic things to study this time, it really goes to the turnout models of the party, to fraud and suppression, dueling legislation, the litigation that Bob mentioned, in which I think both parties are bringing cases that are not really going to help them at all politically or legally, and end up setting bad precedents. So we have a lot of work to do, but there is hope in terms of doing this very much on a local level in a way that helps out our election administrators.
Thanks so much. Now I turn it over to Janae. Janae, I should describe the way you appear at the moment. You and Nina are hovering above us in a two-paneled window.
Well, I hope we're not too blown up on the screen. That's never too flattering. But in any event, I'm grateful to be here and to be part of this conversation about the role of lawyers in elections. And I will say that I think lawyers have an outsized role in elections. And that may sound a little bit controversial, but I say it because I believe that organizations like the Legal Defense Fund, like the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and like so many other peer organizations, have to expend untold resources to protect and defend our democracy because we don't have the appropriate laws and legal apparatus in place to do it without those very costly, time-consuming interventions. So I would very much love to have less of a role in protecting elections, and I would love to be able to expend those resources on other issues of systemic racism and societal inequities. But unfortunately, given that the right to vote is preservative of all rights, and we are doing everything we possibly can to give the voices in our electorate the wherewithal to cast a ballot that will be counted and ultimately will determine, who is in power in our representative democracy, we have to focus a lot on ensuring election integrity in the true meaning of that word, ensuring that the people who turn out to vote have equal access to the ballot, and that they vote within a system that isn't already rigged or formed by partisan lockup, so that even if they are able to cast a ballot that is counted, it is counted within the confines of districting lines and other electoral practices and policies that still make their vote not equal to others in our society. So at the Legal Defense Fund, we are actively engaged in election protection efforts every election cycle. Our work used to be centered mainly around mainly around the general elections or elections that we knew were likely to be subject to very direct voter suppression efforts. We now find ourselves involved in elections year round and having to police and monitor local, state, and federal elections because of the onslaught of attacks, in significant part fueled by the removal of Section 4 from the Voting Rights Act and the disabling of Section 5 as a result, so that there are many voting laws that are now in the stream of our election process that frankly should never have been there and would not have been there had we had pre-clearance as part of our system of checks and balances when it comes to protecting our elections. So the role of lawyers has become much more central, but I should note lawyers like the ones at LDF and the ones at MALDEF and our sister organizations are not the only lawyers in the game. We also have lawyers who are representing parties and don't always represent the interest of voters. We have lawyers who represent candidates and who, as we know, in connection with the last president, filed nearly 70 lawsuits that were frivolous, in my view, and certainly many judges seem to think so as well, because he did not succeed in, I think, all but one, and even that one did not go far. So the idea that lawyers are central to our elections now is really a complex statement, because you're talking about litigation from every possible angle with very different interests in mind, which makes elections that much more costly all around. I think that this is a very disturbing state of affairs. I think that that fact alone demands that we have legislation like the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act to try to control and put in place some standards and mechanisms for our voting system and our electoral processes that are not litigable or not debatable at this point, or not manipulable. There's certain ways in which voters should be able to rely on the system itself to protect them, and not the ability to be represented by lawyers of any association.